Last week we were looking at chapter 44, in which this part of the story, the brothers had gone down to Egypt, and Benjamin, the youngest brother, had gone with them. And then when they were ready to leave, they'd had that meal with Joseph in his house. Joseph planted the silver cup in the sack of Benjamin, and Joseph created this situation in which the cup would be discovered in Benjamin's sack, and then this led to that confrontation between Joseph and his brothers, that Joseph had said that whoever had the cup, that person would have to stay behind as a slave. And as it turned out, it was in Joseph's sack. And then at the end of the chapter, we had that wonderful speech made by Judah on behalf of Benjamin, and his plea to Joseph to allow Benjamin to go home, to go back to his father, and Judah offering himself to stay behind in place of Benjamin, that Judah was so concerned about Jacob, their father, that if news should get to Jacob that Benjamin was not returning, that would break his heart, and it would lead him to his grave. So that was the wonderful speech there, which was that heartfelt appeal. And really it showed the transformation in the character of Judah from how we had seen it earlier, with his involvement in selling Joseph into slavery when the brothers first took Joseph and sold him into slavery, Judah's role in that. And then in chapter 38, the role of Judah in the incident with his daughter-in-law Tamar and his behavior in that story. So it really reflects a great transformation in the character of Judah that we see here, and something that must have struck Joseph as well. So we go into chapter 45 this evening, in which Joseph will reveal his identity to his brothers. So we're going to read here chapter 45, verses 1 to 15. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, I pray you." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither ploughing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Make haste and go up to my father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. And there I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Make haste and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. Judah's heartfelt appeal then touched Joseph deeply, and he could see from this how his brothers' attitudes had changed, the transformation that had come over them. And so there was no need for any further tests or delays, and he could no longer control his emotions. He'd been restraining himself up to this point, and he could no longer force himself to act out this part that he has been playing in this story. And so he ordered his officials to leave the room whilst he stayed alone with his brothers. He wanted to reveal his identity to them in private. Joseph wept aloud in the presence of his brothers, and his weeping or his wailing was so loud that it could be heard by the Egyptians and by Pharaoh's household. So there was this great outpouring of emotions. And he said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" So after making himself known, his first concern was for his father's well-being. He wanted to know if the father whom he loved was still alive. Well, his brothers were so taken aback by this revelation that they were unable to answer, and they stood before him dismayed. Gobsmacked is, I think, the for that. They were stunned or shocked by this revelation, by this news that they've just heard, and they couldn't quite believe what it was that they were hearing here. And they must have been fearful of what Joseph, this most powerful man, what he would now do to them. Would he seek revenge upon them? And that was something that continued to trouble them even after this, through until the death of Jacob in chapter 50 and verse 15. After Jacob's death, we read there that when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil which we did to him." So they were still, even after these events, this was still in their mind, as at some point in time is Joseph going to try to get his revenge upon them. But they need to have no fear of that at all. So aware of their fear here, then Joseph seeks to reassure his brothers, and he called them to come near to him now. So he draws them closer, and then he again reaffirms his identity as Joseph, their brother. And he identifies himself there as the one that they had sold into Egypt. In verse 4, he draws them close. "Come near to me, I pray you." And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." I am that one. He's emphasizing that is really his identity. That this is the same Joseph, the one that they had sold. But now how these things have changed. And he seeks to reassure them and to comfort them, telling them not to be distressed or to be angry with themselves for what they had done. He's telling them to, forget about those things that happened in the past. That's water under the bridge. Don't think about those things anymore. Don't be distressed by that. And he tells them that it was really God who had sent him to Egypt with the purpose of preserving life. He also tells them that on top of the 2 years of famine that they've already suffered, there are still 5 more years of famine to come, when there will be neither ploughing nor harvest. So they're only 2 years into the 7 years of this famine, and Joseph knows how long all of this is going to be. So he's informing them of that situation. And again, he says that it was God who had sent him. In verse 7, he says, to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. God is wanting their survival of this remnant, this small number who would remain on earth. And Joseph acknowledges God's involvement in these events again in verse 8. He says, "So it was not you who sent me here, but God." So 3 times in this short space of time, Joseph says to them, "It was God who sent me here." And he's emphasizing God's control over these events. And then he says it was God who had made Joseph a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. So it was God who had put him into that position. As we saw it from his earlier experiences in Egypt, from his time in Potiphar's household and then his time in prison, we were always told that God was with him in those circumstances, that God was guiding him, God was there for him, placing him into these situations. And ultimately there it is God who has made him into this high-ranking figure there in the land of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. So the evil actions of his brothers had been used by God for this good purpose of saving lives, of preserving lives. And it was God who had directed Joseph's life, then enabling him to become Pharaoh's counselor and to become this ruler over Egypt. God's will had been accomplished then through the actions of Joseph's brothers, although that does not then absolve them of their guilt in the things that they had done. They had done wrong in what they had done, and they were accountable and responsible for their own behavior, but God was still able to use their bad actions in order to bring about something that was good. So Joseph then goes on to instruct his brothers to return to their father and to take the news to their father of what God has done for Joseph there in Egypt. They're to report back to their father and to tell him then to come down to Egypt, where he will be able to dwell in the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen was on the eastern side of the Nile Delta. And there he would be near to Joseph. Goshen, dwelling in the land of Goshen, would set the Israelites apart from the Egyptians and so enable them to retain their identity, that they wouldn't become absorbed into Egyptian culture. So they could retain their identity and they could grow and become this great nation down there in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. In Goshen, Jacob would be near to Joseph, where Joseph would be able to take care of him and provide for him and the family, as there are still 5 years of famine to be suffered, he tells them. And in this way, then Joseph would save them from poverty. He will be like their savior in this situation. Whilst Joseph is thinking simply in terms of saving his family from the famine, in God's plan here, this will show how the promises that God made to Abraham will be fulfilled, and how the descendants of Abraham would become this great people. It'd be there in Egypt that they would grow into this great people before God would then lead them into the land that he had promised to give to Abraham's descendants. Joseph then says to his brothers at the end here in verse 12, "And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you." So finally they come to the realization that this really is Joseph. Your eyes see, and the eyes of Benjamin see, that it is me. I am the one speaking to you. So they recognize that this really is Joseph, the one who is speaking to them, and speaking to them in their language and not through an interpreter, as he had been doing on the earlier occasions. In chapter 42, verse 23, on their first visit there, when they were having a discussion amongst themselves, the brothers, in verse 23 says they did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. But now he is speaking to them in their own language, and they can hear that, and they can understand that it really is Joseph. So he repeats to them that they are to go and they are to tell his father of the splendor that Joseph has achieved there in Egypt, and all of the things that they have seen and the things that they have witnessed. And they are to make haste to do this quickly and to bring Jacob down to Joseph there in Egypt. And Joseph, we're told, then fell on his brother Benjamin's neck, embracing him, and wept these tears of joy, and Benjamin wept on his neck. And then Joseph kissed all of his brothers and wept upon them too. So having overcome the initial shock of this revelation, then, this astounding revelation, they were then able to talk together. So it's a scene of great emotion here, as Joseph very graciously deals with his brothers, and they are reconciled to each other. And his behavior is an example of genuine forgiveness and love. There's no trace of resentment on Joseph's part. There's no anger over what has happened. There's no desire for vengeance here. If we read on here in the last part of the chapter, verse 16 down to verse 28, it says, when the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants well. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land. Command them also, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Give no thought to your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. The sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the journey. To each and all of them he gave festal garments, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 festal garments. To his father he sent as follows: 10 asses loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 she-asses loaded with grain, bread, and provisions for his father on the journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, do not quarrel on the way. So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob. And they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. And his heart fainted, for he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived, and Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is alive. I will go and see him before I die. Pharaoh and his servants then were pleased to hear the news that Joseph's brothers had come. And the instructions that Joseph had given his brothers to go back and bring their father now become Pharaoh's own personal invitation to Jacob. So Pharaoh told Joseph then to tell his brothers to go back to the land of Canaan, to bring their father and their household down to Egypt, where he says they will be given the best of the land. And Joseph has already set aside Goshen, the land of Goshen, for where they will go. And he says they will eat the fat of the land. Pharaoh also commands them to take with them some wagons so that they can transport their families back to Egypt, so that the children and the wives can come back in comfort on these wagons. And they are to have no concern about anything. Don't worry about bringing any furniture or any tools or any of your own goods, because everything you need will be here in Egypt. The best of the land of Egypt will be theirs. So it's a great act of generosity that we see here, and perhaps an indication of how highly Pharaoh regarded Joseph in this, that Pharaoh makes this invitation for Jacob and the family to come down. So Israel's sons then did as they had been instructed, and Joseph gave them these wagons as Pharaoh had directed, and all of the provisions for the journey. He generously gave to each of his brothers these festal garments, these special clothing. But to Benjamin, he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 festal garments. So showing honor to all of the brothers, but especially there to Benjamin in the additional things he gives to Benjamin. So another sign here of Joseph's love for his brothers and his willingness to forgive them. He wanted to provide them with the best. He wanted to honor them. And to his father, he sent 10 asses loaded with good things from Egypt, and 10 she-asses loaded with grain and bread and provisions for the journey back to Egypt. And then an interesting little note: as he sent his brothers away, he warned them, do not quarrel on the way. Perhaps knowing what brothers are like, don't fall out with one another on the journey back, just as when children are in the car and back of the car and having an argument in the back of the car. So he tells them, don't quarrel on the way. That an argument could easily break out over the events of the past. Well, who was to blame for all of the things that had happened in the past? And perhaps an argument over what they were going to tell Jacob when they got home. How are they going to explain all of this to him? Because it will involve them having to confess to what they had done, that they had showed Jacob that blood-stained coat and led Jacob to believe that Joseph was dead. So all of that has to come out in the conversation they have with Jacob when they get home. And so perhaps on the journey home, they would be discussing that and arguing over how they were going to handle that. So when they arrived home back in the land of Canaan, and they told Jacob that Joseph was still alive and he was the ruler of Egypt, Jacob's heart fainted. He did not believe them. Jacob had been very quick to believe that Joseph was dead when he saw that blood-stained coat, but now not so quick to believe that Joseph is still alive. How could that possibly be? It reminds us perhaps of the reaction of the disciples to the news of the resurrection of Jesus as well, in Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 11. Now, when he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. There's a similar reaction of Jacob here when he hears that Joseph is alive, that he can't quite believe it. But then when they told him everything that Joseph had said to them, when Jacob saw these wagons, then we're told that his spirit revived and he was convinced. So the sight of the wagons was, and all of these provisions that had been made, this was evidence to him that to what his other sons were saying to him surely must be true. And so Jacob says, then it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. The one thing that mattered to Jacob now was seeing Joseph. And it didn't matter about all of these things, all of these goods and provisions that had been brought back in these wagons. The one thing that's important to him, it's enough, he says. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. So Jacob, or Israel, the names Jacob and Israel are used interchangeably here. He was now determined to go, make that journey down to Egypt, to see his son Joseph before he died himself. It's a wonderful story that we have here, and it really shows human relationships and human emotions It contains all of the elements, really, of a good story, and how situations change and how people react and how they deal with difficult situations that arise. There are perhaps a few things that we can take from this for ourselves. We see that God is at work in the events of our lives, as he was working in those events of Joseph's life. So God works in our lives too. And God works out his plans in his own way, that those things that Joseph's brothers had done to him could be used by God for a good purpose. And so have faith in him, have faith in God, as Joseph did. We see also from the story the importance of forgiveness. Joseph's willingness to forgive his brothers, not to, that he wasn't bringing up the things that they had done in the past against him. Yes, it had happened, and his brothers were guilty and responsible for that. But Joseph showed his willingness to forgive them. So do not repay evil for evil. This is what Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12, verses 17 to 21. Paul writes here, repay no one evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends upon you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. No, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals upon his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And we see Joseph as an example of this, as one who was not repaying evil with evil, but rather doing good, despite the evil that had been done to him. And then we have to leave matters in God's hand, as Paul says there in Romans. God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So leave matters with God. And still in Romans there in the earliest chapter 8, verse 28, Paul writes, we know that in everything God works for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. And again, the story of Joseph provides us with an example of that, of God working for good through those events in the life of Joseph, that whatever it was that his brothers had intended to do for him, God was able to use that to bring good out of the situation and to save lives. And then in Philippians chapter 4, verses 11 to 13, where Paul says, not that I complain of want, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound in any and all circumstances. I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and want. I can do all things in him who strengthens me. And Joseph had been in that situation as well, where he had been a servant, a slave in the household of Potiphar, and then he had been a prisoner, and then to be raised to that high position in Egypt of second ruler in Egypt there, that he knew the extremes, and he was able to be content in whatever circumstances because of his faith and his trust in God. So there is much for us to learn from Joseph and his story and the things that happened to him.